Let's get things started. Thank you for joining us for the Exit Advisor Small Business Town Hall series. This week we've got Jason Knight again. Jason's been bringing us a really good series, around EOS implementation. And this week it's going to be about building high performance culture within your business. I'd also encourage everyone to, if you missed any of the prior series that Jason's conducted, go to our website. We've got all the town halls, including Jason's, published. You can watch them online, and all the content is there. So before I pass it over to Jason, I'll give the quick Exit Advisors overview. We are Exit Advisors, and we are the lower middle market advisory firm for entrepreneurs and small businesses. We really focus on education and value creation. It's not just your deal representation. We're far beyond that. We really walk you through way in advance of reaching out to a buyer. All the preparation work, and of that preparation work, it's guys like Jason that we bring in to do cleanup, make sure your business is running efficiently, identifying any issues and reducing risk, because that's inevitably what's going to increase the value or decrease the value of your business before going to market. So we encourage you to reach out to us if you're thinking about it, if you know anyone who's thinking about it. We are an education-based firm. As you can see, we host these town halls every week. We have lots of content. We love to help. There's no strings attached. Just, if you want to spitball ideas about something that might be 2-3 years down the road, we welcome you to join us. So without further ado, Jason, why don't you take things over?
Appreciate that. Thanks, Andrew. And again, welcome and glad to have you join us again. I see some of the names that have been on previous sessions, and I'd love having you all join us. And as Andrew said, we definitely encourage you to share your thoughts on topics and what you'd like to hear and see discussed. So today we're going to talk about building a high performance culture. And as you Andrew mentioned, I am an EOS implementer. Our EOS is a business operating system that I use with many of my clients to help create a foundation for vision, for execution, accountability, and drive results. And it works exceptionally well. I had a conversation this morning with one of my clients that were blowing through all their goals much faster than expected, and things are really coming together. But part of what we talk about is identifying a strategy, but at the same time we talk a lot about your team health. And so today we're going to talk about your culture and what it means to the success of your business. You can have the best structure in the world, but if you don't have the right culture in place, we're going to talk about the impact that has. And so before we start, I will share a little bit about my background. I am a professional EOS implementer, but before doing this, I was an entrepreneur like many of you on the call. I've been an entrepreneur for probably 30 years. I hate to say it, that long gives away my age, but most of my life, I've been an entrepreneur. I've been mainly because I'm a terrible employee, but I've always had pretty good luck as an entrepreneur. In those 30 years of experience have spanned different industries, from IT to technology development to aviation world to software development, kind of different industries. And we like to talk about our successes, but today I'm going to talk about a few not so successful ventures and the lessons learned from that too. So I think there's more value in many cases in what didn't work versus what did work. So we'll definitely talk about that. And so after selling my last company that we grew it was around 50 million in revenue, sold it into a roll-up, and then we took over the roll-up and grew it to around 100 million, and then I retired out of that. And in that journey, I used EOS as the tool to help us get our arms around what we're doing and help us see success. So A lot of my lessons that I've learned were prior to EOS, and then the adoption of EOS and the impact that that had. I can share with you all as well. Now, I do work with clients one-on-one. I work with in coaching individual entrepreneurs. I also work with leadership teams and helping them identify where there's gaps and come together and build a strategy. And then I work with them very closely to help them execute on that strategy. So part of my job is to push on the sore spots that no one else is pushing on. So we identify what's not working and help heal that area. And then also my job is to push back and call out areas that maybe others haven't called out. So that's my job. That's who I am. So today we're going to talk about culture and why does culture matter? You know, we talk a lot about strategy. We spend a lot of time on the mechanisms of our business. And if you're like most entrepreneurs, when things are tough, we go to the tangible. We got to be selling more. We got to restructure things. We got to fix these processes. All those are great things. And identifying strategy is a huge part of the success of an organization. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today isn't necessarily succeeding or not succeeding, but it's going to be the difference between a really good company and a really exceptional company. And the culture is huge. If you've read any of Peter Drucker, you know who he is as a business guru. His quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," is so strong because it's true. Patrick Lencioni, if you're familiar with him, has a lot of similar statements like that. So if you've read the multiplier effect, and what he talks about in that is really the idea that most companies are not tapping into the collective intelligence they have within the organization. Most organizations fail to really to excel to the degree they could because they don't have the right culture in place. And so while a healthy culture can be a multiplier of intelligence, we're also going to talk about how an unhealthy culture can work the opposite effect on in your environment and really drag you down. So again, why culture matters. You know, we talk a lot about getting everybody rowing in the same direction. We talk about that a lot when we're identifying vision and where we're going as an organization. And I think that analogy works quite well, right? If you aren't rowing in sync, you're not going to get to the destination you want. But I think taking that same analogy and taking it a step further, right? So if you're familiar with rowing and the precision of a rowing team, if they're not exactly in lockstep, then they're not as efficient as they could be. So when you get those teams that are really precise and functioning as a team and really are working together, they are exponentially faster. You get one that's out of sync, you may still get to your destination, but it's going to take you longer to get there, and everybody else is going to be working harder to get you to that destination. So when we talk about the rowboat analogy, it does work, but think of it not just as can we get there, but how effectively and efficiently are we going to get to that destination. You know, we also often talk about an organization is only as good as its people, and that's largely true. But I'd take that a step further and say that an organization is only as good as its people perform. Because in the end, it's really about the performance of the individual teams, members, and the team collectively together to get to your destination. Sorry. So let's talk about your people, right? So every organization ultimately has, if you've got people, you've got some slice of your people that are really exceptional. They're the rock stars. They're going to excel in every environment. Wherever you put them, they're going to be great. And that's typically 5 to 10% of any population. And this is true of most clients I work with. You've got these rock stars that are exceptional. You've also got, if you're like everybody else, some degree of duds, right? The problem children, and that's again the kind of the bottom 5 to 10% of the organization. But everybody else kind of falls in the middle, the 80% that are the go with the flow group. Now, the reason that's important is because what we find is that go with the flow is going to go one direction or the other. So which flow are they going to go with? So you have the potential of tapping into excellence and dragging them into the good, but they also have an equal potential of being dragged into the negative. And so what we talk about a lot in this is not just do we have good people, because the reality is you do have good people and you got bad, not great people, but you have a lot in the middle. And so a lot of what today is how do we address the culture and how do we intentionally drive the culture that's going to tap into the potential of that middle group. So if you're like most of my clients, and I suspect most of you are, whether we want to admit it or not, we're competing in a commoditized world. And I've experienced this firsthand in many cases. So if you look at the past 5-10 years, it's getting more and more difficult to be unique and to compete. Things are accelerating. Information is easily accessible. It is more difficult to differentiate yourself today than it was 10, 15 plus years ago. So if you look at groups of people and you ask them what they do well, and I've actually done this in a few talks and had organizations that compete with one another and ask them what their key differentiators are to write them down. And you go around the room and you ask them what they are, just what did you write down? It is almost impossible to differentiate one from the other. They all sound exactly the same. They all have the same messaging. Now, it doesn't mean that they all are actually living those out, but to a consumer, it's really difficult to know the difference. They all sound the same. So, and even if you have a unique product, you've got a great product that no one else has. The reality is it's only a matter of time before your competition figures that out, right? Not all your competition are ignorant, and most of them are made up of smart people just like you all, and eventually they figure it out. In fact, one of the lessons I learned, I was a part of a company, we had a construction technology and there was a patent on it out of Northern Europe. And it took a few years to get the patent over to the US and starting to be used in the commercial space, but no one could touch us. We were better than every other old technology in this space. We were doing quite well, but we knew the patent was coming up. And it was interesting, the leadership teams, the owners of the patent were basically saying, well, what we do is so unique. The product we have it took decades to get to market and really get it going well. We have a lock in the market. Our name is synonymous with this technology. And the reality is, the day the patent expired, there were trucks rolling that were doing exactly what we were doing. In fact, they were using products that were newer. They had newer equipment. They had newer techniques. They had the chemical being used. They were working with the same producers. And in fact, those companies, in many ways, had superior formulas that we had not taken advantage of. So overnight, we had competition. And it was very difficult at that point to truly differentiate yourself. The next thing you can say is, well, we've got superior quality. We've got a unique service, and just like the product, that will be copied. It's not a matter of if you'll be copied. It's just a matter of when. If you're successful, someone else is going to do it. So at that point, if you've got the same or seemingly same product, you got the same language around your product service, your quality of service. Well, how do you compete? Well, obviously, price is usually what it comes down to. So the differentiator is price, and that's a losing battle. None of us want to be just the low-cost provider, and it's difficult to get that message across. So what truly makes you different then? So creating a differentiation in this world is not just, do we have a better product and a better service, but do we have better people? So in your company, one of the biggest differentiators in a commoditized world is you guys, your team. So making sure you've got the best team that's functioning, that's the healthiest, that people want to come work for you. You've developed a culture where where people want to be there, that your clients want to associate with you. It's contagious, right? And not in a bad way. But when making sure we've got the right culture that people want to be a part of, and that's what people are buying into. We spent a tremendous amount of time in our companies, not the one I mentioned before, but my technology company, working on culture. And the reality is we had competitors, people that worked for competitors that wanted to come work for us. We had clients that came that worked with us because they wanted to be a part of that culture. They recognized us in the industry, and our people that was the difference. We sold completely commoditized products, but it was the people that was the attraction, and it allowed us to grow and succeed in a way that many of our competitors weren't. So if that is the key, right? If you're able to create a culture that is truly a differentiator, that is something that your competitors are going to struggle with. In fact, if there's examples out in the world there. Ritz-Carlton is a good example of that. When people think of the Ritz-Carlton, they think of the quality of their service. They are so structured around delivering the right experience. In fact, so much so that you can go to the Ritz-Carlton school. They will invite you to their corporate headquarters, and they actually put on schools to teach others how to do what they do. So think about it. You could be Hilton or Marriott and go to the Ritz-Carlton school and learn exactly what they do. But they're confident enough in doing that because that's part of the culture they've created. What you can't replicate is people. And so they've got a system for creating the culture. They were very serious about that. And so the execution it is certainly there. The product may be the same, but the experience is different. So if you can truly create a culture where your culture is different than your competitors, then you're going to succeed and accelerate your growth. So where does your culture come from? So if you think about it, every one of your companies has a culture, whether it was intentional or not. You've got a culture. And it's true when you get any group of people together, whether it's your tennis buddies, your golf buddies, at your church, just a group of friends that get together. There's a culture that develops. And typically that culture isn't intentional. No one sits down as a group of friends and says, okay, what's our vision, mission, values, and talks about that. But it does develop. And that culture is what determines your sense of humor. What do you find funny? What's off limits? What do we do together? What do we talk about, not talk about? Is it high energy or low energy, or is it serious or not serious? There's a culture that gets created with any group of people that get together and establishes the behaviors. And how does that happen? Typically, you've got a dominant personality that is driving that. That's the person that is typically saying, "Hey, let's go golfing. Let's start at 8:00 tomorrow, or let's go meet up at 6:00 for dinner together." And the person that is stepping up and is dominant in that group is typically the one establishing the culture. And that could be good and that could be bad, depending on the personality. So while that happens in personal life, it definitely happens in your work life. So again, if you've not been intentional about determining what your culture is and establishing what the way you behave as an organization, it's still going to get established, whether you want it to or not. And as leaders, we're always in that mode of teaching and driving. And so we're going to talk in a minute about how to do that intentionally. But the reality is you've got a culture in your environment right now. It may be great. It may be terrible. Hopefully you have some idea of which side that is. But if you weren't intentional about establishing it, the likelihood is it got established for you. And normally, again, that's the most dominant person. Now, it could be a super positive, bubbly, energetic, hardworking, honest person that does what they say. And that's great. If you've got that and that's the person that established that culture, then you're in luck. But it could easily also be the negative Nancy or the jerk that is toxic, that creates a bad environment and dominates that culture. And again, if you're not intentional about it, it's going to happen, and partly based on the people that are in the group. So we want to make sure that we're being intentional about it, that we are driving the behaviors and the outcome that we want. So culture should be intentional and systematic. So again, we don't want to just let it happen. We want to participate actively in the creation of the culture that we want. You know, in EOS, we spend a lot of time talking about our core values, and we do have a regimen of how we measure against that. But I'd say that EOS does not go far enough in really being intentional and systematic about driving culture consistently throughout the organization. So when we talk about culture, again, making sure it's intentional, it's systematic, and part of what we'll talk about here in a minute is how to actually do that. So there's a tool that I use from High Performance Culture, CultureWise, and they've got basically an extension or expansion of the core values piece that we do within the EOS. It basically breaks down your culture and the maturity of your culture, maturing of your culture into 8 steps. So for the sake of time, we're not going to spend too much time in all 8 steps. We're going to focus on 2 key steps, but we will touch on all 8, and I'll come back then and spend more time on the 2. So the first is defining your culture. Obviously, we've got to understand what culture we want to drive. Who do you want to be? So if you understand the organization as it exists, now there's a couple of exercises we go through in EOS to discover what you value within the team that you have. And so we pull out those behaviors, the core values that we want to really grow and we want others to live up to. Now, you're going to see that we talk a lot about fundamentals in this, and I'm talking values and fundamentals and behaviors. We're going to talk in a minute about the difference between those, but the reality is when we think, you see fundamentals here, think the behaviors that drive the culture that we want. So we need to define your behaviors. The second is we ritualize. So ritualizing or creating a habit out of it, it's practicing those fundamentals consistently and getting it to where it's a part of everything you do. So it's not enough just to say it and put it up on the board. Those posters that say teamwork and all that stuff, that's great and all, but the reality is it's not creating the culture that you want. It's not ritualizing the behaviors. Again, there's nothing wrong with having posters on the wall or the core values written in your email or written in cursive on your wall, but don't expect them to just absorb it and start reflecting those behaviors. We want to make sure that we're driving those whenever possible. The next is selecting, and that's getting the right people in the right seat. We spend a lot of time on people within EOS because that is going to make or break your organization, as we've been saying. So it's important you've got the right people in place and selecting those. How do you know if they're a fit? Now, this is really tough. It's easy to say you got to have the right people and make the right hires. And the reality is there's times that we'll interview people and we'll think, man, she is just perfect for the job. She's a great fit for the organization. Her resume is in alignment with what we need. Her references checked out. She's great. And then you bring them on board and it doesn't work out. That happens, right? Unfortunately, it's not great, but it does happen. But what we want to avoid is kind of the opposite of that. And how often have you gone into a hire where you knew there was red flags up front, you knew it wasn't the right person, but you hired them anyway, and you try to change that person, or thinking that, hey, well, they're rough on the edges, but we'll make them what we need. And the reality is about 1% of the time that's possible. 99% of the time it fails miserably. And so when we talk about selecting the right people, we want to make sure we understand what that is and what that looks like before we do the interview. And we've got some processes of doing that and identifying up front the behaviors and, frankly, the driving your disciplines, the behaviors, the culture that you want starts before you even do the interview. It's a part of your posting of the job. I mean, there are so many things that go into guiding that culture from day one. The very first interaction with that person is where the culture begins. The next is integrating. So integrating or onboarding or however you want to state that. The nice thing about the word integrate here is it's the sense of assimilation, right? So we're not letting them bring their culture into ours. We are assimilating them into our culture. And that starts on day one. If you've got a great onboarding process, that's great. Most organizations don't. My very first real job was I started at an office, and I walked in day one. They pointed me to a box on the ground of flat wood, and I had to build my own desk and started from scratch. And the culture was right off the bat was you're on your own. It's all up to you. You figure it out. You do it. There was no teamwork, and the culture continued for still is to this day of that type of environment. It's not healthy. And so from day one, you have the opportunity to establish that great culture and get it off on the right foot. Next is communicating the culture throughout the organization consistently, making sure that we've got that every time we turn around, we are communicating what our fundamental behaviors, the culture that we want established. The people understand what our culture is. They see it everywhere. We talk about it. We have common language. It's something we're consistently communicating to our teams and sharing with them. It's heard, it's understood, it's used throughout the organization. Sixth is reinforcing the culture. So actually calling out situations where the culture is being lived out or not being lived out. People will look to you as leaders to understand what's important or not. So if you say it's important and you turn right around and you don't do anything about it, because if it's not being done and you don't call it out, you accept it, well, you've just essentially accepted that change in your culture, and you are establishing a new culture. So in coaching, whether you know it or not, you are coaches and teachers. If you're a business owner or you're a manager, you're a teacher. And it's not a matter if you want to be, you just are. And so that's something we're constantly coaching our teams and using those behaviors to recognize. And we always say we want to reward and reprimand based on these behaviors. We want to identify the right people, and we want to repel the wrong people by communicating and clarifying our culture. The seventh is leading, right? So leading by example. The reality is it starts with you, right? So the culture can't be different for you than it is for the rest of the organization. So if you say we do what we say we're going to do, or we practice, one of them we often will include is practice blameless problem solving. Well, if you're blaming everybody else, or you're not doing what you say you're going to do, you're not following through, well, you're demonstrating that culture. Believe it or not, you're teaching them. That's the way we work. And so leading consistently by example is super important. And then lastly, driving through accountability top to bottom, so that it is used as a tool. And we'll talk about how to use your core values, your fundamental behaviors as a tool in the organization to manage people. So we're constantly getting feedback. We're using it to have our discussions with our staff on whether or not they're living up. Are they working in the culture? Are they a part of the culture in a positive way or a negative way? And managing to that. And again, we can talk about that as well. So let's come back to defining your behaviors. So the difference between a value and a behavior is pretty distinct. So values are ideas. They tend to be a little more nebulous and hard to nail down. If you look at most people's core values, you often have things like integrity or quality or respect or innovation. Those are all great, admirable things, but they don't always mean the same thing to everyone. As respect, as an example, so I grew up in the South, and so I say yes, ma'am, and no, sir. I doesn't matter your age. I mean, you could be 20 years old and I'm going to call you ma'am, or you could be 90. That's the culture I grew up in. It's a respectful way that I approach people. But in my time that I've spent in other parts of the country, especially the Northeast, you call somebody ma'am, and I actually had this, I totally offended her. It was not respect. It was the exact opposite. And so when you talk about respect, you either need to be really specific on what you mean by that and not make assumptions that the values that you've laid out mean the same to everybody in the organization. You go to different parts of the world, and here in the U.S., if I look you in the eye, it's respectful. In other cultures, if I look you in the eye when I'm talking to you, it can be considered aggression, or disrespectful. And so, making sure that we're clear on what we mean. But that's the problem with values. They tend to be ideas. And what we're after to create the behavior that we want, or the culture we want, is identifying the actions, the things that are really clear on what they mean. We honor our commitments. We practice blameless problem solving. We're a fanatic about a response time. We're clear on our expectations, and we communicate those. Those are actions that they're verbs that you can follow, right? To say, okay, are you doing these things? And we can measure that. So making sure that when we talk about our fundamental behaviors, and again, I'm going to use them as it's synonymous with values as it relates to EOS. The core values are typically the ones that we drive are really behaviors. They're not ideas. So if you, again, back to integrity, I've shared this before, but everyone seems to have integrity and quality and respect, innovation, those kind of things are in their honesty, our values, again, difficult because they're ideas. They're also not differentiators. If you go look at your competitors' websites, I'd be willing to bet most of them have the same core values you've got. And the reality is they don't often mean much. So integrity, as an example, I've said this before, Enron and WorldCom both had integrity as their core values. The Houston Astros had integrity as a core value. Well, they clearly haven't lived up in many cases to that core value. Now, it's not to say that they aren't recognizing where they departed from that and can't get back in alignment with them. Certainly hope the Astros do, but you saw where it took Enron and WorldCom. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Whereas the behaviors, it's a lot easier to measure. And by the way, we're going to talk about how you drive that home by even going so far as doing surveys with your clients and saying, here's our fundamental behaviors. How are we doing in these areas? When we say we honor our commitments, we think we are, but how do you think we're doing? And use that as a feedback. I mean, so it's not just something that's lofty, but genuinely, this is the culture we value. So if you talk to a client and said, okay, we practice blameless problem solving. How did we do in that area this last quarter? And you want to know, because that's the culture we want to drive. It's not just something we say, it's something we do. So behavior is easier to teach. It's a lot easier to coach around that. And it's a lot easier to give feedback. So that's what we're after, is the tangible that we know that we can manage, and it will drive a culture. It'll help start creating a culture that has the results that you want. If you think about respect and integrity, it's hard to understand the results that come from that. It's almost like the opposite. If you didn't have integrity, well, we know the results of that is bad things will happen. But short of that, it's hard to understand the value or the impact of integrity. Whereas when you start breaking that down, we definitely want integrity, but the way it looks to us, integrity really translates itself in these ways, with these behaviors that drive that. So there is a tool, and so we talk a lot about how to do this, and so part of it is developing a curriculum that you can consistently drive home with your staff. So it's not just a matter of putting on the wall or sharing it once or twice, but just like in sales, we talk about you have to say something 7 to 12 times to be heard once. Well, when it comes to fundamentals and the behaviors, it's even more so. Right? We've got to consistently communicate those. And so understanding what it means, first off, right? So practice blameless problem solving. What does it mean? Well, it means you apply your creativity, your spirit, enthusiasm to develop solutions rather than pointing fingers and dwelling on problems. We identify lessons learned, use those lessons to improve our processes so we don't make the same mistake again. We get smarter with every mistake. We learn from every experience. That's a behavior that you can point to and say, do you understand what this means to us? And we want you to adopt that. And so that's what we're talking about, getting very specific in the definition of what our fundamental behaviors are. So the next is ritualizing. So ritualizing, again, it's like creating habits. So practices become ingrained as automatic behaviors over time. So ritualizing is something that isn't common. But if you think about it, I mean, it is in a way, right? So before every sports game, you go to a kid's soccer game to the world, any kind of a world stage of sports. Here in the U.S., at least, you're going to do most likely the national anthem. That's just part of a ritual. If they don't do it, it kind of feels weird. So, but when it comes to rituals, it's something that's sometimes hard to get established. But I will ask you, so if I asked all of you, how many of you on Monday morning said, okay, this is the week. I'm going to be 100% committed to doing this thing. I don't want to miss a single day. I want 100% success. I'm going to do it. This is the week. I'm going to brush my teeth every day. Right? You don't think about it. You do it. You don't think about it. You don't have to remind yourself to do it. It's not something that you have to force yourself to do. It's just something you do. It's part of your routine, your ritual that you do. And so a lot of what we're talking about is getting things ingrained in people so that they're common rituals that they follow. It feels weird not to do it, right? So that's what we're after. So rituals help make things last. Once we get rituals ingrained in people, it happens over and over and over consistently. That's what we want. We want it to happen without us having to continually correct people to get them back in line with that. And eventually that will happen if we establish rituals. So one of the ways to do it is identify the fundamental or the behavior or the value, we can use those words synonymously, the fundamental of the week that we want to drive. So identifying one that we're going to really focus on. Everybody in the organization is going to focus on the same one this week. And we can create a structure. So for instance, I've got clients of mine that will, at the beginning of every meeting, almost like a prayer before a meal, which is a ritual that many folks have, right? This is before starting of every meeting, we go through the fundamental of the week. We talk about what it means. We talk about some examples where it's had a positive impact, or maybe some examples where someone has lived that out, or maybe some challenges that we're having to live up to that, right? But we touch on it. We don't derail the meeting, but it's 3 to 5 minutes, and then we move on to the meeting. Imagine if every meeting in your organization with all the different teams started with a review of that fundamental. And we do a different one each week. And then eventually when we're done with them, we wrap back around and we do it again. We're consistently driving home that behavior that we want to make sure is established within our environment. So again, it goes back to being intentional in creating the culture you want. So behavioral change isn't easy. As we know, we all have bad habits. Establishing a good habit can be really challenging. And what we're talking about is really not breaking bad habits, but establishing new habits that may have not been there before. So part of it is internalization, right? We've got to be determined that this is what we want to do. We need to understand what it is, and we need to internalize that. So this isn't too different than learning to fly an airplane or play the guitar or learning a new language. It's not something you can just go watch a bunch of YouTube videos, or if you see the instructions on the wall occasionally and you're going to suddenly know how to do it. It happens through practice. It happens through creating those rituals and over again, getting it ingrained in you. So in order to really change behavior, you have to internalize it, and you have to have repetition. So again, if you're going to play the guitar, you can't just watch a YouTube video and never actually practice the guitar and be great at it. Or if you practice it once a month, you're not going to be great at it. It requires thousands of hours of practice. Any of you on this call that are great at some specific instrument or something, playing tennis or golf, it requires commitment and continual repetition to build a muscle memory that just comes from doing it. But if you ask people, how many of you really love repetition? No one does. No one loves repetition. So the problem is that we know that in order to be great, we have to do repetitions, but yet we hate doing repetitions. How do you span that gap, right? That's a huge challenge we've all got. And the reality is creating rituals, right? Getting it to where it feels weird not to do this. So we're consistently building rituals that we are following up on. We've identified the fundamentals. We talk about them all the time. We reference when something good has happened. We reference the fundamental that came from. We talk about when things are bad, why it went off the rails, and tie it back to which of these behaviors we didn't do, right? Making sure that new people coming in automatically are brought in and assimilated into our culture. We're intentional about that, consistently talking about it, using it, training it. It becomes a part of our meetings. It becomes a part of our speech. And so when you're talking to clients, it's something that you're sharing with them. It's something that you just built into your environment. I highly recommend, again, if you're not doing this, but surveying your staff and surveying your clients to see if we're serious about this, how are we doing in these areas? Not just, hey, did we give you the lowest price, or did Bob follow up with you, but are we living this out? Are we honoring our commitments? How does that look? And using that feedback to consistently improve. And that will demonstrate to your team that you're serious about the culture. It'll demonstrate to your clients that you're serious about the culture. And what you're going to find is that people who appreciate that culture are going to come to you. Clients that appreciate that culture are going to come to you. People who don't appreciate that culture are going to be repelled by it. And that's okay, because what you want is your culture to be consistent and have the impact. You want the team that reflects that culture. So just to wrap up, good companies have good cultures by chance, right? You might have a rock star that happens to be influencing your culture, but world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. They're intentional about it. And again, this isn't a success or not success, right? You don't have to do this to be successful. I'm sure many of you are not doing this consistently, and you've got successful companies. It's the difference between a good company, though, and an exceptional company. That's the difference. If you look at the world-class companies that are out there, they've got world-class cultures, and they're consistent in the way they drive it, and they live it out. So that is the quick summary. So Andrew, I don't know if we had any questions along the way. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Looks like Jose was asking for could you share some of the hard to see indicators for high performing managers to look for?
So there's the indicators you're talking about. So we could talk about KPIs and metrics, and obviously those are valuable to be measuring within the organization. And I don't, depending on when you ask this, we may have covered some of this, but the reality is that you want to drive the culture that you want versus looking for those who just happen to have them. And so the process that we go through in identifying this, we've got a whole exercise we go through in identifying what those behaviors are, those indicators. What do we want to drive in the organization? What are we measuring? And there's if you run into challenges where you're having a hard time understanding what you do value as an organization, we go through a simple exercise to start with. It's the high level, and then we go to a second more detail. But the high level is thinking through the 3 to 5 people in your organization that are those rock stars. And then understanding, what do you value about them? What is it about them? So you listed Bob, Sally, Jim, Joe, right? And then what about Bob do you really appreciate? Now, don't forget the negatives, but what is it about him that made you put him on the list? We start putting those together, and then we go through all of them, and then we go through a combining exercise to say, okay, well, maybe that's not so important, but these are really, that's key. That's why we're successful, why everyone just loves Bob, or why we have had success in these clients, is because of these behaviors. So we start calling those out. So that'll give you some rough out of what they should be. And then, frankly, I've got a big database. It's a curriculum of core values. There's something like 65 of them that are in there that are already defined, that typically match up with what you've already started to identify. We start to build some of the more detailed definition of the behaviors and use a system to consistently measure and drive those behaviors in the environment.
Great answer. Got another one here from Marco. He asked, is it common for companies to incorporate a reward bonus program to recognize employees during these cultural behaviors? Driving these cultural behaviors.
Yeah. So part of it is we want to ritualize this. So eventually it's going to be, consistently be driving it everywhere you turn. Yes, they may be reading it. Yes, they may be hearing it, but yes, they're going to be managed to it. And all right, so if people are exceptional in living up to these cultural behaviors, then I think it's a great idea to reward them based on that. I think it's also a great idea to reprimand those that are not. Because again, if you said this is who we are, then honoring our commitments is important. If you're not honoring your commitments, you're not living up to the culture that we've established. And therefore, we need to get you on track with that. And so having hard conversations to address that is part of that managing of that environment. But yeah, for sure, I never think it's a bad idea to positively influence people to live to the culture. The danger there is you don't want people to only do it because they're getting rewarded. You want to do it because it's like brushing your teeth. It's just what we do. If you've ever been a part of an environment where you go in and this is just the way we behave, that's what we want, right? Where people coming in think it's weird not to comply with the culture that's been developed.
Yeah, I'd actually even add to that. There was a lot of good things at Bank of America, but one of the few good things I'd say, even for as bureaucratic as B of A is, where I was formerly many, many years ago, in my first role, we had a kind of a global recognition thing where your managers could submit. There might have been a monetary thing, or you win some kind of doodad. But I think what really stood out is that your coworkers could also put you up for some sort of award, right. Like a global recognition. And so if you're working on a project together and you're done, pull the Band-Aid off, and it was really nice to see not just your managers praising you because they're trying to rally you, but your peers saying, hey, he did such a great job, or she did such a great job on this project. So I'd encourage it to be lateral, not just vertical.
I agree. I'm a huge fan of that. In fact, some of the tools out there, CultureWise is one of those, where they actually have a way for people to submit recognition with their peers. And so there's a bit of a gamification of it, right? So
yeah,
you get some points and some recognition. I think that's great. Again, that's driving the behaviors that you want. Anything you can do to drive positive behaviors, I think, is always a win. Again, you don't want them to do it just because of the reward, because eventually it becomes the culture. But recognition of the culture is key, and making sure that people have an opportunity to call out in a positive way their peers, I think is huge. Peer pressure is oftentimes more powerful than manager pressure.
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. Any other questions?
Not seeing any yet, but if you have any last minute ones, feel free to submit them. I think we got another. Let's see. So let's see. Jose said he applied for a position with 200 plus applicants on LinkedIn. He was referred by a VP, but I didn't have any response. I'm in touch with the hiring manager, but didn't want to fall on the annoying list of applicants. Any advice on how I could work my way into this list? It's a very high performance team.
So first off, I would try to understand when you say high performance team, I'm trying to identify what their culture is, right? So what do they value? They probably state it. If they actually have a clearly defined behavior, a set of values, they probably have listed them out there. So if you can identify what that is, and if it genuinely aligns with who you are, I would say that reaching out in a way that can help them understand that there's alignment there for sure. Persistence isn't bad. I always told my salespeople that positive professional persistence, PPP, different PPP, is always important. All right, so nothing wrong with that. And if there's 200 applicants, others are probably reaching out too. But if you're not responding to them, you also could get lost in the group. So persistently, professionally, politely respond, and I think that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I'd say the squeaky wheel gets the grease, especially if there's that many. And try it on LinkedIn, try the in message feature, maybe try to track down their email if you can. That can be a little more effective and direct, but
definitely good.
Well, I think that's about it. Before I let you have your closing remarks, Jason, I'll remind everyone. So next week we're going to have Gary Cooper. He's going to do a little bit of a unique piece. It's going to be as apolitical as we can keep it and as unbiased as we can keep it. But we're going to be reviewing the presidential tax implications with either party, the current Trump administration or the potential Biden-Harris administration, just to see what tax changes could be implemented in the future and what that can mean to your personal finances, your business finances, but just really a review of the tax legislature that's being proposed. So I think it's really good. I encourage you to share it with anyone. This is relevant to everybody. It doesn't have to be very specific to any one particular facet of business. So keep an eye out for the invite. Check out our website there. Last thing I will say is that reiterating, make sure you check out the resource page on our website for the prior town hall series. Jason's got a lot of stuff that he's worked up to this point, and it's all relevant. And I think it's really important to check it out. Jason?
Yeah, and that's it. Really, I'd say if anything I've said triggers a thought you'd like to have a conversation, don't hesitate to reach out. You got my email and phone number is not on there. It's on the first page. But I definitely encourage you to reach out, like I said, and happy to help out. And if you feel like you want to go through the exercise with your team to identify what your fundamental behaviors are and how to drive that high performance culture in your environment, or you're interested in EOS, let me know. I'm happy to help out. And with that,
Great.
wrap up.
Thanks, Jason.
Talk to you soon.